Hello, hi, this is Dr. Jeffrey Mark. Today I'd like to talk to you about part 3 on fatigue, low energy, and stress. And we're going to be discussing today more about this important topic. I asked you some questions the first 2 weeks on whether you had energy, whether you were able to accomplish the goals that you had accomplished, whether you're satisfied with the level of energy that you have now, or that you see other people having more energy and that you'd like to have more energy yourself. Some of you have been getting by the day with more caffeine and energy drinks. I told you about the importance of why fatigue is a major problem, not just the accidents that can occur from sleepiness, but also the lost hours at work. So we all discussed this in the first part. The second part, we also talked about what other aspects of what comes about with fatigue. And then we want to address the causes, and we did go through some of the causes last week. So if you wanted to take a look at our discussion last week, that would be very helpful as well. This is just a graphic summary of some of the things that we address with the energy problems and in the functional medicine realm. So we talked about 3 myths of misconceptions. We did go through myth 1, and that is that just fixing one thing would fix everything. And that's not necessarily true, of course. You want to focus on all the causes that could be causing the issues with the energy. And this is looking again to thinking that we need to think outside the box, because there may be some other causes that we haven't addressed. And then if you're able to address all the causes, then you have a successful outcome. We looked at low energy, fatigue, and stress. Let me just put this here, and I'll put this up here. In terms of infections, deficiencies, toxicities, and inflammatory triggers. We looked at broad categories of infections. We looked at broad categories of deficiencies. We also looked at inflammatory triggers as well, in terms of heart disease, inflammatory conditions such as airway, allergies. All these things play a role as well. So when we find the causes, we address each one, then we can have a result. So that's why it's important that we need to find all the causes, and we need a systems approach to make this possible. So we're going to talk about the second myth today, which is to focus on the right strategy to find the infection, deficiency, or toxicity, fix the causes that are found, and then that fix will fix the energy problem. That's what the strategy has been. And this approach actually focuses more on labs. So we have this axiom where people say, hey, we're going to look at things and test and not guess. We're just going to see what's deficient, and we're going to address that. But oftentimes we don't realize that it's not just about the numbers of what the lab tests show, but it doesn't reflect necessarily the whole story. So the story, the picture, the history is what is the most important part of the detective work of determining what the causes are and how best to approach addressing the causes. Normal also doesn't necessarily mean optimal. For an example, for vitamin D levels, many of you have seen levels on the scale that between 30 and 100 nanograms per milliliter is considered normal, which is true, but like the recommended daily allowance, it's the minimal amount just to get by. In the example of vitamin D, if you have optimal levels, which is between 40 to 80, breaking down this further, if you have between 40 and 60 nanograms per milliliters, then your mood and immune system response is much better. If you're closer to 80, then you'll have a better risk reduction actually of cancer, because your immune cells will be optimized for surveillance and targeted to look at abnormal cells. So it's very important that you realize that these normal ranges are just more for people in the middle of the bell curve, and that there are outliers that some may need more to be optimal. So this approach with the labs, you also want to know that the story of where you have been and what's happened to you, including childhood history, gives us a terrain or landscape on which to look at the numbers or the values of whatever test we have, because those levels may mean you want to have higher levels than what's normal, as I mentioned, an optimal amount. And there are other areas where if you're trained, if you're relatively healthy in certain areas, that being in the normal range is okay. So that has to be addressed, and that has to be based on one's story and one's evaluation. And 80% of the time, we actually can make the diagnosis or figure out the causes based on the history. So asking the right questions and having the right experienced person asking the questions are vital. So the detective is also as important as the proper questions. And the labs may give you false information if it's not collected correctly or stored or processed in the right way. So that is the weakness of relying on labs, on just solely looking at numbers. Kind of like flying an airplane just by instrument, and you can do that, but if you look out, you can see where the horizon is, and where you can also see where the sun is as well. So you can orient yourself multiple ways, and the best is to use a combination as necessary, or at least focusing in on the story and the history. And then we want to treat according to the causes that actually will result in the symptoms. So we look at symptoms, we can track and adjust the treatments based on the symptoms as they resolve or get better. And we can also confirm and monitor the supplements and treatments with the labs as needed. So you can see where the treatment is being targeted both by symptoms and by looking at some of the numbers. Now, these are a list of deficiencies that can cause symptoms, that we can ask questions and determine that these areas are problematic. And if we're not sure, we can always order tests on top of that to confirm. These include the adrenals, which is like a salivary cortisol level, but you can also determine how one's energy level is in the morning compared to the afternoon, compared to the evening. And you can also address other things such as what you're eating, whether it's healthy, organic, whether you may have some pesticides or exposure to glyphosate or other types of pesticides. Also, ideas of sleep. There's sleep questionnaires and certain questions that you can get, and that gives us an idea, but you can also measure things like melatonin. Testosterone, also, we can just see how much energy and muscle tone and stamina. Those are other questions, and you can verify with testing as well. So that's just some examples. These are deficiencies that we see more on testing, more than just asking symptoms, and that includes folate, iron. So these are measures that may not be obvious, because it might take quite a bit of iron. It might take quite some time for iron to be low enough for you to see anemia or feel fatigued, and it might be gradual enough that you may not be excessively tired, at least for quite some time, until your hemoglobin level is low if you have low iron, in which case you're not making enough red blood cells. Vitamin D is very important as well. As you know, most people are low in vitamin D and they don't know it. Sometimes you can get some symptoms. You may have mood issues, being depressed and things like that. But again, sometimes it's hard to tell unless you're very, very low, and we often measure for that. Then these are the toxicities that are seen with symptoms and that are confirmed with tests. So like in the first group with the infections and things, you can see these as well. So this would be like constipation, electromagnetic frequency, radiation exposure, inhaled allergies and things. So some of these things are toxic things that we can measure, but also are suspected, like for food allergies. If you have some triggers, like obviously a hive after certain types of food, or headaches, those are symptoms that we can ask. And then we can also do antibody testing to see if there are antibodies or a reaction that your body's having. These are infections that have symptoms and that we can confirm with tests. So a lot of these unusual type of symptoms are these Borrelia type things that have fatigue. They may have certain symptom patterns, Epstein-Barr, certain types of chronic fatigue type symptoms, and intestinal infections like diarrhea and other types of bloating like bacterial overgrowth, things that are suspicious that we can actually confirm with tests such as breath tests, or looking at vinculin or zonulin. Other types of specific types of blood tests can also help us sort those things out. So those are the things that that we want to emphasize, is that it's not just the testing, but it's also the questions and the detective work that's involved that will help. And that's why that second myth of it's just testing and looking, it's more than just testing and looking, it's actually asking the right questions. But we'll also go into more treatments, or what the process of treatment is in the next week. But I also wanted on this week's update, on COVID update, to talk to you about new studies that show that there's risks of eating at restaurants, and this Brady-Kinen hypothesis. So let's go first with this one here. I'm going to move my screen out of the way. Move me over here. So this is showing that community and close contact exposures associated with COVID-19 among symptomatic adults over age 18 in 11 outpatient healthcare facilities. And this was based on this study done in July of 2020. So here, what was done was they interviewed people that were exposed or had confirmed COVID-19, and they looked at these 11 major healthcare facilities, and they found that the positive COVID-19 people were twice as likely to have reported dining at a restaurant. Now, they didn't distinguish whether this was indoors or outdoors, but just the mere fact that masks are not really worn and social distancing is not really can be adequately maintained at a restaurant, because you're eating, so you need to have the mask off, that there was a higher rate, or this was a common association, or more common association than other factors. So this just shows that we have to make more efforts at reducing exposure when mask and social distancing are difficult to maintain, such as when you're eating and drinking. So that these are other considerations of how this proximity, this contact, this inhalation exposure of transmission of disease is very important. So just to keep in mind that in the past week, New York has opened up for indoor dining, but again, this study seems to show that that is still very risky behavior, unfortunately, unless you're in a population that's closer to herd immunity. Now, in New York, we believe that there's approximately 20% of the population that's been exposed to COVID. So, but they're still not quite there at the 70% or 50 to 70%, depending on what paper you read, towards herd immunity, so that there is risks involved. The other study that I want to talk to you about was this Brady-Kinen storm hypothesis, which is, as you know, we've talked about the cytokine storm hypothesis, and both of these can be related. They actually used a one of the supercomputers, the second fastest computer actually. It's called the Summit supercomputer, and they analyzed 40,000 genes from 17,000 genetic samples of COVID-19. And the researchers found that there was a large expression of genes that were represented from the renin-angiotensin system, or RAS system. And this is a bradykinin-based system, which is a peptide that causes blood vessels to leak and causes fluid to accumulate in organs and tissue. And when the system is imbalanced, then you get a lot of fluid that can accumulate, for example, in the lungs. So with SARS-CoV-2, CoV-2, the entry point is through the ACE2 inhibitors, ACE2 receptors, which I've explained to you before, usually in the nose, but then once this gets through the nose or in the lungs, it causes the rest of the body to what we call upregulate ACE2 receptors so that it can get into other areas such as the intestines, kidneys, and heart. So it's kind of like a burglar that sneaks into this open second door or second floor window in your house, and then once it gets in, it starts to disable your alarm systems or whatever you have of security in your house, unbolts the front door and the back door, and gets everything opened up so that other viruses or other CoV-2 viruses get in and hijacks basically your cellular machinery. And again, like I said, it upregulates the ACE2 receptors so that more of these receptors where the virus can get in are kind of created or opened up in all these other cells. And then what happens is that there's this bradykinin storm, which affects the renin-angiotensin system, which causes, normally this is broken down by the ACE or angiotensin converting enzyme, but this system just gets overwhelmed, and that's why you get all these symptoms. And like I mentioned, there's a cytokine storm system as well, where there's oxidative stress and damage, so that can also directly lead to damage of the capillaries, as we talked about before. And these two systems combined wreak havoc on the entire body. So this whole system causes leakiness of the blood vessels, which we see, and this fluid accumulation in the lungs. The worst thing is that not only do you have the fluid accumulation, you have something called hyaluronic acid that's also produced in the lungs, and this production is amplified. Hyaluronic acid is something that's used in soaps and lotions because it holds on to water, absorbs a lot of fluid and liquid, so it's good for lathering and making the soap. But it also causes problems when you try to aerate or try to get air through. So it makes the water like a gel or almost like a jello. So that's why there was problems initially with ventilators, and that it was trying to push air through and you're trying to almost breathe through the water in the lungs, which quickly becomes almost like a gelatinous jello-like consistency. And that's why the ventilators have not been very successful because of that. This hypothesis explains also about the heart damage, which occurs in 20% of people with COVID. And that's because the renin-angiotensin system is involved with the heart contractions and blood pressure as well. So when this system goes awry and imbalanced, blood pressures can sway up and down, and heart damage can occur. Also, dizziness, delirium, strokes are seen in 50% of hospitalized patients, and this is also from the renin-angiotensin system that can be seen. Fortunately, however, there are drugs that we have already available that are approved from the FDA that are used to treat the renin-angiotensin system. These include danazol, stanozol, and a few others that I've listed here. So these might be useful for treatments in people that have this bradykinin storm that before they get on a ventilator or as they're on the ventilator, to at least try to mitigate or decrease this bradykinin and to kind of recapture or get better control of the renin-angiotensin system. Vitamin D is very interesting because it also is involved in the renin-angiotensin system. And I told you about vitamin D being a potent antioxidant and also involved with that cytokine storm and having enough to balance, to have good immunity and to balance your immune system. And I mentioned that also as well as part of the evaluation in the first part of this talk. So it's all about prevention. So vitamin D seems to play multiple roles, whether you favor the cytokine storm hypothesis or the bradykinin storm hypothesis, which they probably both work together. But the vitamin D helps reduce levels of the REN, or the gene that makes the renin, which is part of the renin-angiotensin system, so that this helps, again, down-regulate this uncontrolled bradykinin storm. So we have these multiple mechanisms, and again, vitamin D is very, very important, as you know. So if you have further questions on functional medicine, on how this can help with brain health, gut health, and immune health, just contact us by email. You can email info@jeffreymarkmd.com or call us at 925-736-9828, or if you'd like to schedule a consultation. So next week we'll be talking about strategy to treat the low energy, fatigue, and stress. And this is some of the things that we'll be talking about next week. So hopefully we'll see you next week. Until then, take care and stay healthy.